Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to everybody. And I would like to thank, first of all, the organizing committee for inviting me to give this lecture about carcinogenesis from low doses of radiation, those doses that you expect to see after diagnostic applications of ionizing radiation. I don't have any disclosures. And let me start with a very brief overview of the biological effects of radiation. Cellular DNA is considered as the primary target of ionizing radiation. Two kinds of biological effects of radiation are generally recognized: deterministic effects, or tissue reactions, which result from extensive cell killing in an organ or tissue, and stochastic effects, which can result from proliferation of viable but mutated cells after erroneous repair of the radiation-induced DNA damage. Of course, both cell killing and cell mutation are rare outcomes, because cells are extremely capable and effective in repairing most of DNA damage induced every day either by radiation or by any other cause. Deterministic effects are usually observed in a relatively short period of time following the radiation, whereas stochastic effects are probabilistic in nature and may take years or decades to manifest. Now, when they are observed, for deterministic effects, there is a dose threshold below which no effect is observed. For doses above the threshold, the probability of appearance rises quickly. The severity of the effect also increases with dose, again of course for doses above the threshold. Some well-known deterministic effects include cataract of the lens of the eye, temporary or permanent sterility, hair loss, skin erythema. These are some typical dose thresholds for deterministic effects. You can see that they are in the order of some gray, with the exception of eye cataract with a dose threshold of almost half a gray. What about the stochastic effects? Well, the probability of appearance increases linearly with dose, probably without a dose threshold, at least none that is generally accepted. But we will come back to that, because what actually happens in that lower dose region is actually the basic issue of the rest of this talk. On the other hand, the severity of the stochastic effects is independent of the dose. Stochastic effects include cancer and hereditary effects. In the latest recommendations of the International Commission for Radiological Protection, issued in 2007, the total nominal risk coefficient was estimated to be 5.7% per sievert, the cancer risk being 5.5% per sievert and the hereditary risk 0.2% per sievert. From the early days of radiation protection and until about the late 90s, the primary concern for protection from the medical use of radiation was focused on the protection of the medical radiation workers, medical staff who were occupationally exposed to ionizing radiation. There was very limited concern about the radiation doses to patients from diagnostic procedures. This attitude started to change with the introduction of helical and multi-detector CT, which led to a dramatic increase in the number of CT scans performed and a significant increase to the collective radiation doses received by patients from diagnostic procedures. The National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, the leading radiation protection organization in the US, estimated in 2009 that the annual average exposure to the US population raised from 3.6 millisieverts to 6.2 millisieverts from the early 80s to 2006. And that increase was due to medical imaging, whose contribution raised from 15% to almost 50%. And as we said, this increase was primarily due to the explosion in the use of CT, which jumped from 3 million scans in 1980 to more than 60 million scans in 2006. What are the typical doses from diagnostic examinations? Well, for CT, they range from 2 to 3 millisieverts to about 15 millisieverts. For classical radiological examinations, they range from a thousandth of a millisievert to a few millisieverts. And for nuclear medicine, they range from a few millisieverts to 15 millisieverts for PET. Driven by the rising concern for the increasing population radiation doses from medical examinations, the US National Academy of Sciences and its Scientific Committee for the Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation issued a report in 2006 on the health effects from exposure to low levels of ionizing radiation. This report summarized the attained knowledge on health effects of ionizing radiation that came basically from the studies on the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, but also from other sources: nuclear industry accidents, nuclear weapons testing, nuclear industry workers, medical radiation workers, etc. This figure simplifies the conclusions of the Bayer Committee for the excess cancer risk from radiation for the US population. The normal cancer incidence in the US population is 42%. That is, about 42 of 100 people in the US will be diagnosed with cancer at some stage in their lives from causes not related to radiation. These are the black circles in this figure. If these 100 people are all exposed to 100 millisieverts of ionizing radiation, then we would expect this exposure to result in one more cancer, this black star. As it was implied earlier, sound epidemiological data for cancer risks after exposure to ionizing radiation are available for radiation doses above around 100 millisieverts. For doses higher than about 100 millisievert, the cancer risk rises fairly linearly with dose. From the early years of radiation protection, and based on the accepted at that time biological mechanisms for cancer induction, it was proposed that for doses below 100 millisievert, the cancer risk would continue to decrease linearly with dose down to zero dose. This became known as the linear no-threshold model, the LNT, for the stochastic risks of radiation. LNT is not the only model that has been proposed. Presented in this figure, there are also other models. The hypersensitivity model, which supposes that cancer risks for low doses are higher than those predicted by the LNT. The threshold model, which considers that there is a dose threshold below which the cancer risk is actually zero, and then it rises linearly with dose. And the hormesis model, which supports that low doses of radiation are actually beneficial and not detrimental, and reduce the naturally observed cancer risk. I have to say that today, no one of these models is universally accepted by the whole scientific community. The LNT model has been endorsed by literally every national and international radiation protection organization, and until the Bayer 7 report, 15 years ago, there was little debate about its usefulness and validity. But during the last 15 years, it has been strongly disputed. If we accept the validity of the LNT model, we can calculate cancer risks for radiation doses lower than 100 millisievert. For example, for doses in the range of doses for diagnostic examinations. Since a dose of 100 millisievert can result in one excess cancer in 100 people, one can deduce that a dose of 10 millisievert would result in one excess cancer per 1,000 people, or that a dose of 1 millisievert could result in one excess cancer per 10,000 people. In 2007, the ICRP, the International Commission on Radiological Protection, published its latest recommendations, where it was clearly stated that there is general agreement that epidemiological methods used for the estimation of cancer risk do not have the power to directly reveal cancer risks in the dose range up to around 100 millisieverts. Despite that, soon after the publication of the Bayer 7 report, several articles appeared in the literature predicting numerous cancers arising from radiation exposures from diagnostic examinations, based on the risk estimates of the Bayer 7 report and the assumption of the LNT model. This is an article published in 2007 at the New England Journal of Medicine by Brenner and Hull that predicted that about 1.5 to 2% of all cancers in the US might be attributable to the radiation from CT studies. And this is an article from Amy Barrington de Gonzalez, published in 2009 at the Archives of Internal Medicine, that predicted that approximately 29,000 future cancers could be related to the CT scans performed in a single year in the US. As you can imagine, such articles made huge headlines in the public media, ABC News, the Wall Street Journal, and provoked a large and growing anxiety to both the general public and to the medical community, an anxiety that was largely unproportional to the risks involved. This anxiety urged scientific and professional organizations to issue statements and policies on radiation risks from medical exposures. This is one that was issued by AAPM, the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, in 2011, which stated that the risks from medical imaging at doses below 50 millisievert for single procedures or 100 millisievert for multiple procedures over short time periods are too low to be detectable and may be non-existent. Predictions of hypothetical cancer incidence and deaths in patients' populations exposed to such low doses are highly speculative and should be discouraged. These predictions are harmful because they lead to sensationalistic articles in the public media that cause some patients and parents to refuse medical imaging procedures, placing them at substantial risk by not receiving the clinical benefits of the prescribed procedures. And this is another report from the UNSCARE, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, which stated that the committee does not recommend multiplying very low doses by a large number of individuals to estimate numbers of radiation-induced health effects. It was clear that in order to resolve the issue of cancer risks at low doses, large epidemiological studies were needed with enough power to reveal such small cancer risks. And since it was generally considered that children are more sensitive to radiation than adults, it is of no surprise that the first landmark epidemiological study that appeared in the literature was this study by Pierce et al. In 2012 at The Lancet, studying the risk of leukemia and brain tumors from CT scans performed in almost 180,000 children and young adults in the UK. Cancer incidence was obtained from the UK's NHS Central Registry. The results showed that cumulative doses of about 50 mg could almost triple the risk of leukemia, and that doses of about 60 mg could triple the risk of brain cancer. The authors were also able to produce dose-response curves, which showed a fairly linear relationship between dose and relative risk, both for leukemia and for brain tumors. In these graphs, a relative risk of 1 means no excess risk. And of course, one should also note that some of the individual confidence intervals in these risk estimates, these error bars, include the value of 1. And we are always talking about doses lower than 100 millisievert. This is another study from Australia with even a larger sample of children, again showing an increased cancer risk incidence with increasing number of CT scans performed per child. There was no dosimetry information available in that study. That's why the linear trend shown in this graph is with increasing number of CT scans performed in each child and not with dose. On the other hand, in this 2014 study from Taiwan, with almost 25,000 children under 18 years of age, who were exposed to a head CT scan and were compared to almost 100,000 unexposed children, no significantly different overall cancer risk was observed between the two cohorts, but a significantly higher risk of benign brain tumors was observed in the exposed cohort. An increased, but not statistically significant risk for leukemia was observed in this 2015 German study, which enrolled almost 45,000 children exposed to CT. That same year, an article from the president of the ICRP stated that these recent record linkage studies of cancer risk following CT scans must be interpreted with caution. These studies were questioned for being confounded by indication, a situation also called reverse causation, meaning that the reported cancer associations may have not been related to the radiation from the CT, but to the patient's underlying health conditions that prompted the CT exam in the first place. A well-known example of reverse causation was observed in a thyroid cancer risk study after thyroid examination with iodine-131. Thyroid cancer risk in the exposed group was found to be elevated when all reasons of referral were included, but when the researchers examined separately those children who were referred for suspicion of a thyroid tumor from those children who were referred for other reasons, they found no increased cancer risks for the second group. It was the children's health state that promoted the iodine thyroid scan that led to the observed increased thyroid cancers, and not the scan itself. You might recall that the results from the lifespan study of the atomic bomb survivors, which is traditionally considered the most significant cohort for the study of radiation effects in humans, were among the most significant results supporting the LNT model. However, in 2017, the latest results for solid cancer incidence among the atomic bomb survivors indicated that the dose-response shape was not fully consistent with the results previously reported, raising unresolved questions. These are the corresponding graphs showing excess relative risk for solid cancer as a function of dose, separately for males and females. As you can see, the data for females fit reasonably to a linear curve, and that an alternative linear quadratic curve does not provide any significantly better fit. For the males, however, you can see that the linear quadratic response fits significantly better to the observed data points than the linear fit, indicating that the slope of increased cancer incidence at low doses might be smaller than the one at higher doses, an observation that is in contrast to the LNT model. In 2018, the NCRP reviewed the most recent epidemiological studies for cancer incidence in humans from ionizing radiation, and the results were published in this report, the NCRP commentary number 27. 29 older and more recent studies were reviewed, and they were evaluated according to the evidence they provided in support of the LNT model. The results are shown in this table, and you can see that 5 out of 29 studies provided strong support for the LNT, 6 out of 29 provided moderate support, 9 out of 29 provided weak to moderate support, 5 out of 29 studies provided no support, meaning that they were actually showing either no association of cancer incidence with dose or even a negative association, an hormetic effect, and finally 4 out of 29 studies were considered inconclusive. The conclusion of the report was that the LNT model cannot be scientifically proven by epidemiologic evidence at very low doses or low dose rates, but the preponderance of high-quality epidemiologic data is reasonably consistent with the LNT assumption. Other models that differ from the LNT cannot be excluded based on current data, and there is evidence from some datasets that the slope of the dose response at low levels of exposure may be less than that at higher levels. NCRP concludes that based on this data, the LNT model should continue to be used for radiation protection purposes. This is a more recent review of epidemiological studies, some of which, but not all, were also included in the NCRP review. And this is a graph showing excess relative risks for solid cancers for the different studies reviewed. We can see that there are more data points that lie on the right side of the zero line, corresponding to studies revealing a positive excess relative solid cancer risk, and fewer points on the left side of the zero line, corresponding to studies revealing a negative excess relative risk, an hormetic effect. Of course, as you can see, most error bars cross the zero line, indicating not statistically significant results. This graph, however, shows the corresponding excess relative risks for children, and as you can see, all data points now lie on the right side of the zero line, and most error bars do not cross the zero line, indicating significant excess risks for children. Similar results were found for leukemia. Again, this is a graph for exposures in adulthood, and we see data points on either side of the zero line, with almost all error bars crossing the zero line. Whereas for exposure in childhood, we see more studies revealing a positive excess relative risk for leukemia, and half of them being statistically significant. Finally, this is an even more recent review concerning, again, pediatric populations, and this study has also performed a meta-analysis of the 24 reviewed studies. This study reviews both prenatal and postnatal exposures, CT scans and radiographs, and the meta-analysis showed no significant increased cancer risk for prenatal exposures. For postnatal exposures, increased risks of leukemia and brain tumors were observed only for the CT scans and not for the radiographs. And these are the corresponding diagrams for the excess relative risk for leukemia and for brain tumors. So what do all these studies finally show? Well, first of all, it is now widely recognized and accepted that the LNT is not a model to be used for risk assessment. It is a conservative model to be used only for radiation protection purposes. Some organizations, like the French Academy of Sciences, have adopted this attitude more than 15 years ago, stating that the LNT can be a useful pragmatic tool for assessing rules in radiation protection, but it should not be used without precaution for assessing by extrapolation the risks associated with low and very low doses. Adopting LNT for radiation protection purposes is in essence an application of the precautionary principle. Since we cannot definitely prove or disprove that even a small dose of radiation can cause cancer, it is reasonable to adopt a conservative approach, accept the LNT, knowing that we might exaggerate on the risks, but making sure that we err on the safe side. And this seems to be a logical approach. And the consequence of this approach is the adoption of the ALARA principle. Keep the doses from diagnostic examinations as low as reasonably achievable. Where has the ALARA principle led us? And the other radiation safety promoting initiatives like Image Wisely and Image Gently? Well, they have driven the industry to improve imaging equipment and techniques with the aim of producing high-quality images with the lowest achievable radiation dose. So we now have CZT gamma cameras with more efficient detectors, and we have new iterative reconstruction algorithms and image correction software to perform scanning with only half the dose compared to the doses that we used to have some years ago. CT scanners have also more efficient detectors, and new iterative reconstruction algorithms became available, which reduced image noise and allowed scanning with lower radiation doses compared to the traditional reconstructions with filtered back projection. During the last years, artificial intelligence and deep learning was introduced in CT scanning, with even more sophisticated reconstruction algorithms for better image quality with less radiation dose. It was thanks to ALARA that we have established and adopted children-specific CT protocols and finally stopped imaging children using the same acquisition protocols that we used for adults, which gave 2 to 3 times more doses to children. Thankfully, in nuclear medicine, we didn't have that issue. Pediatric doses were established very long ago for nuclear medicine exams. And it is thanks to ALARA that the annual cumulative medical radiation dose to the US population has dropped by almost 20% between 2006 and 2016, from almost 3 millisieverts to 2.2 millisieverts. You can see here from the corresponding values of 2006 and 2016 that the contribution of CT scanning to the total dose has increased from 50% to 63%, but the absolute dose value from CT scans has dropped slightly, from 1.46 to 1.37, despite the fact that the total number of CT scans continued to rise. Note that it has risen by 20% between 2006 and 2016. And if you're wondering about the corresponding values for Greece, unfortunately we do not have comparative results because the first study of collecting radiation doses to the Greek population was published in 2015, but the mean effective dose was calculated for medical exams was calculated to be 1.8 millisievert per person, and more than 80% of that dose was due to CT scans. So adopting the precautionary principle and being on the safe side has been proven quite useful. But could it also be harmful? Some people think that exaggerating radiation risks can sometimes produce more harm than good. A very popular argument in the nuclear industry, for example, is that the very strict radiation protection policies guided by the LNT result in spending large amounts of resources for minimizing an already minimal risk, resources that are deprived from other urgent needs. Scientists in support of the Hormesis model point out that almost 1,500 deaths occurred due to the evacuation of the Fukushima area after the nuclear reactor accident, an evacuation that was not justified based on the minimal risk due to radiation. In several European countries, and also here in Greece, it has been estimated that the first months after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, many women in their early stages of pregnancy proceeded to induced abortions due to radiation fear. This is a study from Greece that estimated that the month following Chernobyl, 23% of early pregnancies were artificially terminated. And of course, as stated before, exaggerating on radiation risks can lead patients to refuse to proceed to properly justified medical examinations involving radiation exposure. And let's not forget that over-reduction of radiation doses for diagnostic medical examinations may hinder image quality and render them uninterpretable and non-diagnostic, therefore minimizing the benefit for the patient and thus violating the first radiation protection principle, the principle of justification. This latter point is very clearly pointed out at the latest AAPM policy statement, which characterizes current epidemiological evidence for cancer risks from radiation doses below 100 millisievert as inconclusive, and stresses that the medical physicists strive to improve medical imaging by optimizing radiation doses while ensuring that the needed level of image quality is obtained. To conclude, there is no doubt that radiation is carcinogenic. For radiation doses higher than about 100 millisievert, cancer risk is reasonably linear with dose. The risk of cancer after radiation with doses below about 100 millisievert is yet uncertain. There are epidemiological studies supporting that there is a small measurable excess cancer risk, other studies that find no statistically significant excess risk, and even some studies where a normatic effect is demonstrated. The LNT controversy may not be resolved soon. Most official international organizations still consider the LNT model to be the best available model for radiation protection purposes. All official international organizations agree that the predictions of the LNT model should not be used for risk assessment, and most regulatory bodies and policymakers follow these recommendations. Refusing to perform a justified medical examinations solely due to the risk of radiation is unjustified. Performing properly justified medical examinations under optimized practices is the way to maximize their undisputed benefits for the patients while minimizing their hypothetical risks. It is our duty as medical physicists and generally of the medical community to fight against unjustified radiation fear and help patients, carers, and parents put radiation risks from medical examinations into the right context. Thank you very much for your attention.